pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with another page 112 tag. This will definitely be the last page 112 tag that I ever film in this apartment because I'm moving out in about 8 days and I just am not going to get around to filming another one here. You won't see this video until I'm long, several days or weeks settled into the new place, but this is the last one. Anyway, I have 3 books for you. This is a mix of books that I picked up at Kinokuniya Books, is the English language bookstore at Shinjuku in Tokyo, and they 2 or 3 times a year have a 20% off sale, and so I splurged and spent money I didn't have a couple weeks ago. Here are 3 of those books. Check the show notes if you don't know what the page 112 tag is. I'm not going to waste any of my regular viewers' time explaining it. Here is book number 1. You'd better own up to your crimes. If you confess, we might be lenient. If you don't, we'll fling you in jail. I had a gash on my face, a bump on my head, and aching shoulders, but I wasn't seriously wounded. I glanced around me and didn't spot anyone I knew, apart from old Fu. The peasant from Shandong was squatting by the door. His padded Mao suit was ripped. He was so big that, even when squatting down, he was a head and shoulders taller than everyone else. The charcoal burner in the middle of the hall was blazing. I was sweating in my down jacket. A plainclothes officer walked in and demanded to see our documents. All non-students were made to stand on the other side of the hall. The Shandong peasant looked up and said, "I came to Beijing to do a little business. I didn't intend to create any trouble. I'm supposed to be taking the train home tonight." "Don't act so innocent. Didn't you say you wanted to complain about the injustices you peasants suffer? That's why we arrested you. Keep your head down." It was only then that I recognized him as one of the 2 men in workers' clothes who told me I'd dropped my banner. The non-students were dragged outside and shoved onto a bus. I could hear someone screaming, "You've got the wrong person. I was just passing by," and a woman shouting, "Let me go home." It sounded like she was trying to force herself off the bus. I could hear her punching and kicking the metal sides. The rest of us had to stay in the hall. In the evening they brought us some bread. I volunteered to hand it out. A young officer told me to step forward. He looked about the same age as me. I presumed he was a new recruit. Having heard me speak in a proper Beijing accent, he said in a friendly tone, "This isn't a very good way to be spending New Year's Day, is it?" "You're right," I said. "I had no idea it would be so cold today. In weather like this, the best thing to do is go to Dong Lai Shun restaurant and have a nice lamb hot pot." "If you lot hadn't caused all this trouble, I'd be at home now, enjoying a hot pot with my family." I wanted to speak to old Fu, so after I handed out the bread, I went to squat down next to him. Okay, well that is very interesting. It's very fast-paced, dramatic story happening here that we are entering right in the middle of, and it sounds pretty ominous and social repressive, where obviously we're in China, and it sounds like we're maybe in one of the dark times of modern Chinese history. And I was really gripped by this. It's just kind of workmanlike prose, there's my phrase. There's nothing special about the writing, but the story is very interesting. And I am really worried about what's going to happen next. So they are being detained. The narrator is being detained. He seems to be a student. There is a separation of the students and the non-students. The non-students, did they get the shit end of the stick? They're carted on a bus, but they don't want to get on that bus. So then what's going to happen to the students who are still in the building or in the room? The conversation between the narrator and the officer at the end was very interesting. Kind of a connection over class or age. And who is old Fu? He's mentioned at the beginning and again at the end, but I don't know, just based on one page, who he is. But no, this is very intriguing. I enjoyed it. Book number 2. Tattered and grease-stained novels circulated the wards, losing a few more pages from time to time, used by indigent patients to cope with the improvisations of their bodily ailments, accumulating more layers of grease from one reader to the next, as well as hairs, wax, and dandruff. Sometimes his companions summarized the curious plot for him. In the yard, he told more or less everyone about his uncle, and about Hill 131, whether they wanted it or not, shouting, as deaf people do, to anyone who fell for it, so that everyone knew him by then. "Hello, 131!" they shouted, though he didn't hear them, poor thing. "Bye, 131! Say hello to your uncle, and see you again on Civvy Street. See you when you've got your pension. Long live military service!" Not a single trick had worked. In the end he became lethargic, as though resigned, in a kind of moral torpor, and also the widow, who, after all, had been in such a hurry. It has to be said that she was something of a tart. Better off without her, that one. After all, he tried to convince himself, it's really not so bad here at the Central. But then he'd get worked up again about the wedding, the linen, the farmhouse, about sick leave, 30 days, plus 4 days' travel, at least. Then he had a letter written to the widow that she had to be patient, that the last examination, the last ordeal was very close, that the pension was certain. Not even General Ramirez could do him out of it now. 6th grade of the 5th category. And the widow, reading those letters with a 4-leafed clover inside, sob, sob, wasn't entirely insensitive to that cry of pain. A state pension was always a state pension, even if it were 5th, or perhaps 9th. And so the days went by, one after the other, maturing like insipid pears. The odd cigarette, the odd job from the duty quartermaster to carry 20 kilos of paperwork from one floor to another, the odd brass knob to polish, knobs on the metal doors of the verandas with pumice, leaving them all brightly polished and scratched. Well, that is fascinating, and I love the writing. I don't really understand what's going on, but I am really curious. So this fellow, do we know his name? No, where he's nicknamed 131. Is he in prison or in a mental hospital or mental institution? I'm going to say maybe prison, but I can't really tell. He's not in a happy place, and he's deaf, so maybe older. Who knows if he's older? Curious about these tattered and grease-stained novels passing from hand to hand. But what is this Hill 131 and about his uncle, and about a pension and the widow? That is all just fascinating, and I don't really understand what it is, but it seems like he considers that he's in line for a pension, and he's trying to snag this widow in marriage because he'll have a pension and she's mildly tempted. I don't know if I've got that right. I liked the writing a lot, and especially the days were maturing like insipid pears. That's a lovely image. And there's knobs that he's polishing, leaving them all brightly polished and scratched. Yeah, very curious. I really like it. Yeah, this one grabs me a lot. Book number 3. Excuse me, sir, but I was assuming you were from the Cordon Society. The Cordon Society? I'm sorry, what is that? The young man glanced towards me, some of his earlier awkwardness returning. I'm sorry, sir, it's my mistake. I assumed you were from the Cordon Society. I'm afraid I'm not. I'm simply an old acquaintance of Mr. Kuroda's. I see, an old colleague. Indeed, I suppose you could say that. I gazed up again at the young man's painting on the wall. Yes, indeed, I said. Very talented. Very talented indeed. I had become aware that the young man was now looking at me carefully. Eventually he said, I'm sorry, sir, but may I ask your name? I'm sorry, you must think me most rude. My name is Ono. I see. The young man rose to his feet and went over to the window. For a moment or two I watched the steam rising from the 2 cups on the table. "Will Mr. Kuroda be long now?" I asked eventually. At first I did not think the young man was going to reply, but then he said, without turning from the window, "Perhaps if he has not returned soon, you should not detain yourself further from your other business. If you don't mind, I'll wait a little longer, now that I've made the journey out here. I will inform Mr. Kuroda of your visit. Perhaps he will write to you." Out in the corridor, the children seemed to be banging their tricycle against the wall, not far from us, and shouting at each other. It struck me then how much like a sulking child the young man at the window looked. "Forgive me for saying this, Mr. Enchi," I said, "but you are very young. Indeed, you could only have been a boy when Mr. Kuroda and I first knew each other. I would ask you not to jump to conclusions about matters of which you do not know the full details." Well, that one didn't grab me so much. I mean, it's a Japanese story. There's a lot of Japanese formality with much more negative emotions, very thinly disguised under the surface of all that politeness, but it didn't grab me at all. So it may just be an unlucky page 112, but I was not taken with that. Alright, so I think maybe you know my preferences from my reactions. So this is going to be a shorter page 112 than usual, which is good because I don't really have time. My first pick is the book number 2 about the man in the prison or in the mental institution with his pension and his story about, what is it? Hill 131 and his uncle and his pension and the widow and the brass knobs. The days going by like insipid pears. That one grabbed me the most. And I like the writing the best from that. My second pick would be book number 1, which, while the writing was just writing, I mean, it was just prose, it just told the story efficiently. The story was very compelling and drew me in. The Chinese story. And a fairly distant third, I have to say, is book number 3, where Mr. Ono is waiting to see Mr. Kuroda, and Mr. Kuroda's young assistant is being quite officious and snobbish. Didn't do much for me. Alright, so now I'm going to reveal them to you in the order in which I chose them. So my first choice, which was book number 2, is a novel translated, an Italian novel, and I love the cover, but I don't really like the color scheme of the title. Can you see that? It's The Experience of Pain by Carlo Emilia Gatta. But look at that. It's worse when you go into the inside flap. I can hardly read that. Otherwise, it's a beautiful softcover book with French flaps and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, this was written during the fascist 1930s and World War II, partially published at that time in literary journals or something, but not fully published until 1963, and then translated from the Italian by Richard Dixon in 2017. So, Bruno, please weigh in. I told you I was going to have an Italian novel in translation. What do you know about this guy? So this is about a repressive, if I can read the damn white writing on the blue French flap, about a highly educated man in an increasingly repressive South American regime. So that's fascinating that he wrote it during the fascist era of Italy's modern history, but set the story in a repressive regime in South America. And it was published in Italy. That's fascinating. I want to find out much more about that. Sounds interesting. So everybody stay tuned for Bruno's enlightening comments in the comment section below, because this one sounds intriguing. And maybe Bruno might be interested in buddy reading it with me. He can do it in Italian and I'll do it in English. Anyway, so that's my first pick. My second pick is a Chinese novel, Beijing Coma by Ma Jian. And this is the first book I've ever acquired by him, and it's a tome. It's actually 666 pages, and it was published in 2008. Now, he is interesting. I didn't know this about him, but he lives in Britain. I think he went into exile in Britain, and his British wife is also his translator. Her name is Flora Drew. So I don't think this was ever published in Chinese, but I could be wrong. It doesn't say on the copyright page that it was, but I believe that his work is only published in English, translated by his wife. This novel, like I say again, what a tome, is about a man who was shot in the head during the Tiananmen massacre and is at home, unable to communicate, but still somewhat perceptive ever since. And people are coming to visit him and describing how China is changing. And I think the setting is, I don't know how modern the setting is, but it's some years after the Tiananmen massacre. And that's the story, and the past and the present all blur. So, one of my favorite novels is also set, part of that novel is set during this era of Chinese history. Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeline Tien. With that one under my reading belt, I'm very much looking forward to trying Beijing Koma. And I just can't seem to win with Kazuo Ishiguro. This is his Japanese novel, An Artist of the Floating World. I bought this because I thought, I might be more into his Japanese novels set in post-war Japan, and maybe I will be. But that page I thought was really boring, and I just can't get along with him. I read his Never Let Me Go, liked it when I read it, and then with each passing month and 6 months and years since I finished reading it, I like it less and less, and I bailed on The Buried Giant. It was boring. So, I'm going to hope that this was just an unlucky page 112, but otherwise this will be my last try for the writer that I just can't get along with, Kazuo Ishiguro. So, that's my page 112 tag. What would have been your picks? Let me know in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.